My name's Kehimkar. I'm the CEO of Kinkor Consulting, and I've been in recruiting for the past 23 years.
I'm Natasha, Kehimkar, CEO of Malida Advisors, and I've been in people talent in DEIB for over 25 years.
I'm Michael Case, and after 20 years, I've accepted that I'm a recruiter, and I will always be a recruiter.
I'm Mathew, Caldwell, CEO of RocketPower, and I've been in the recruiting world for over 25 years.
All right.
Sure. Yeah.
We all ready?
So last time we chatted, we kind of started talking a little about managers and how they have been dealing with the stuff they've had to deal with and how they are maybe getting prepared to deal with maybe what's coming. Any thoughts on how managers or organizations can be resilient in times like this and how they can really prepare for what's eventually going to happen, the tech bounce back?
Should I go? I'll go.
You go.
So the way I look at resilience is, with organizational resilience, it's not as simple as a workshop or bringing in resilient individuals. There has to be some concerted effort to harness that resilience and harness the skills and capabilities that people bring in so that they're resilient for a bigger purpose, bigger than their own little cohort, bigger than their own little world, bigger than themselves. And that, when I look at organizational resilience in companies, I look at what we call biomarkers. So came out of life sciences, so biomarkers resonates for me, but you could call them indicators. But it's a series of elements that we explore and we look at individually in isolation and then in combination to determine how resilient an organization actually is. Having values and purpose be really clear is one. Having a really strong aligned executive team is another. The investment people make in management, in the management cohort, is another. How organizations deal with change and have historically dealt with change, layoffs and restructuring. So not just change like we're introducing a new product, but difficult challenges like we have to restructure, we're doing a layoff, we're cutting out an entire line of business and we may lose some people and we're going to reshuffle the rest. How organizations go through that, it's very telling. And so I look for that. I look for those combination of factors. And there are others, but those are the biggies that I would want to highlight. I think the opportunity that companies have is to stop thinking in terms of individual leaders and individual teams and really think about how they're working across the organization. A lot of leaders are thinking just about themselves. So they're thinking about their functional lines and they're not thinking about the combination. And that's that first team, that first principles. What really matters, it's not really your functional line, it's the org as a whole. When execs get that right, we start to see that organizational resilience come through much, much more strongly.
I could probably build on top of that. You started to go into the area that I was thinking about, which is great opportunity. And tell me if this resonates with what you just said, is that I'm going to give some numbers and go back to it. So I'm going on a little bit of a tangent. Humor me here. Before this recession, there were 11 million openings in the US and there were 7 million people looking for work. That number still probably, the amount of jobs still probably exceeds the amount of people, even though we're kind of at a low point right now. So what that tells me is if your organization's going to build on that opportunity that's in front of them, they restructured, so now they're getting ready to scale, they know what they're going to build or sell, most likely the talent that they could utilize to move forward might be on their team already. And so the opportunity to reskill and to pull people from the different organizations, just like you were saying, to maybe focus in other areas might be right in front of them. They just haven't asked those questions yet. And I think a resilient organization would understand what are our opportunities with the employees that we have. We can start building out now because it's a little bit slower. We can position them correctly, because the idea that you're going to solve all your problems by hiring them, and this is coming from a person that focuses on hiring, is not realistic. You need to look at that as there will be people in the market that will help bring you forward, but there's people that are on your team right now. So why not position them for success right now? Why not use this time to get ready for what we talked about in our last session of potentially a bounce back in Q4, or we felt pretty good about Q1. So,
but are most startups, we mostly work with startups in tech, right? Are they going to make these kinds of investments early in their life cycle? I find they're usually just so busy promoting people into managers and saying go forth and manage, and not having the time or maybe even the thinking about, we should roll out programs, L&D programs or things like that. And I remember when I was at Apple, this is dating myself, we launched the iPhone while I was there. Steve was openly hostile to the idea of L&D. Like, he hated it. Like, it was well known within the HR team that L&D wasn't a thing until he somehow changed his mind after a while. But so I think that's a long-held current in Silicon Valley. Just hire smart people and they'll figure it out. And I wonder if that's a resistance that you might find to figure out how to make great managers.
I'm curious, something you just said, and it kind of ties into what you guys said. He changed his mind.
He did.
So
He did.
Resilient organizations figure out how to do these types of things. Who in organizations are going to have the ability? Is there a function in the organization that has that ability? It sounds like he didn't have a ton of respect for HR's opinion.
So he hired the dean of Yale Business School, who was a former strategy professor at Stanford, who literally wrote the book on strategy, to create Apple University internally.
But what made him decide? I mean, because I'm curious what caused him, because he had to change his mind at some point before he hired that person.
I don't know, but something happened for sure. It was a sudden change.
Yeah. You work with a lot of leaders. Like, do you see specific roles or types of individuals that can help a person like Steve Jobs or others change their mind and stuff like that?
The revenue leaders are often the ones, because they rely on product, they rely on CS, they rely on multiple functions, and they're client facing. That a little bit of, noise goes a long way. Mm-hmm. So I have found the revenue leaders tend to be the ones that will really push. And if it's more of a product or engineering driven company, it's the head of engineering typically. Yeah. So and it's usually something's gone wrong. Something's gone very wrong. And when we start to dissect it, it usually comes down to people. The technology can be solved. So even with life sciences, people have said, like, curing cancer, that's hard. Leading people, that's not hard, is it? So the soft skills are actually the harder skills. The harder skills are actually the ones that you can probably tame a little bit more easily. And that's where I think it's usually something goes wrong. So executives will sort of have that change of heart or have a different perspective all of a sudden. It looks like all of a sudden, but it's typically because something terrible has happened, right? A product has failed, a launch has failed, a team that was heavily invested in has fallen apart. Somebody that they really respected and appreciated has said to them, this is not right, this is not working. But it usually takes a few things for a pattern to emerge, for somebody to realize and get hit upside the head that, yikes, I've got to actually make a change here and we have to do something differently.
Do you think that thinking back with when Steve Jobs decided to do that, was there a failure around that time of some big consequence within Apple that made him potentially change his mind? Or
not that I was privy to, although that's when the growth really started going crazy. So there's maybe some things related to that. Although one thing that Steve did do was always bring his first level directs on stage to talk about their failures in front of him, which is always pretty amazing and must have been terrifying to do. But pretty amazing to get these leaders to go up and talk about failure, which is already in itself a good management technique, right? We talked about failure in our last session, right? And so learning from failure is important. But
so that right there, like you were talking about resilience with managers, being vulnerable in front of your team, being open in front of your team, talking about failure. How important is that at helping managers be resilient, and helping teams be resilient, and helping companies be able to navigate times like this?
I think it's important. I think vulnerability helps. It helps you connect with the people that work for you. I think there's still fear of letting people know that you failed or you're not on track and what's going to happen out of that. You know, when your leader comes forward and says, let me tell you about the time I crashed and burned and what I learned, maybe you feel a little bit more open. Because that's always kind of how I felt in the environment I've always fostered with my people. It's like you're not going to get it right every time, but what do we learn from that? So. Mm-hmm.
I think the piece about asking leaders to be vulnerable, it is important, but how that vulnerability shows up will vary, right? So for some people, it's sharing a little bit about their personal story. Maybe it's career focused. Maybe we want to respect people's boundaries at the same time. I think we get into trouble when we talk about vulnerability with people who are in underrepresented groups. So when we talk about having a woman of color, this has happened to me, you need to be more vulnerable. Well, there are lots of things that happen when you are. And there is a perception that we need to be strong, we need to project confidence, because any sort of ding in the armor is going to be a problem. And it can mushroom. All of a sudden, any vulnerability or failure that you've talked about becomes your label. And it's attributed to you, and it's because of. And while people may not sort of think about the fact that that is one element of your career, it becomes your career. And so vulnerability for people of color and women of color in particular, and Black women especially, it's a really big challenge to ask for vulnerability. So, it's always the, work twice as hard, because you're going to need to work twice as hard in order to get to where everybody else is. That it conflicts with the need to be vulnerable. And so that's why I say I think there are opportunities for us to be vulnerable. It's how much do we share? What facet of ourselves do we want to reveal? It matters. I do think talking to people about career opportunities or things you might have done differently, that can be a real opportunity. But sometimes people don't feel comfortable sharing their upbringing. And that's not just people of color, by the way. That's everybody. We all have all these different dimensions of diversity that we experience and that we live and that are sitting in our backpacks. What we bring out is very personal. It's one thing for a CEO to be vulnerable. And even then, that person may have a very hard time being vulnerable, but they have positional authority, right? They are the CEO. It's their baby, it's their company, and they have a level of authority that a lot of people in maybe more the middle cohort may not have. So it's riskier to be vulnerable. So I think being vulnerable as a leader is critical. I just think we need to understand that there are nuances that come into play, and having sort of a blanket statement, say that again, I bang the table, having sort of a blanket statement on leaders should be vulnerable, it's not the same for everybody.
That's interesting. Didn't think about that. Is there a safe way? Is there some safe ways that you can think about for people in underrepresented groups? I mean, it might be different for each person, but it sounds like what we just said kind of triggered something with you about like certain things that we think about as vulnerable as maybe not acceptable or not safe.
I think that I will speak from my own personal history. I never really thought of myself as a woman of color. I thought of myself as a woman, but that's about it. It never went further than that. I didn't think about how people might perceive me because I grew up in companies where that was not, it didn't matter. I was appreciated for everything I brought, and it wasn't because of certain things that I didn't get opportunities. I got tons of opportunities. At the same time, for me to talk about what it was like being the only non-white kid in my school growing up all the way through probably grade 10 or 11, how much do people want to hear that? And then you go through traditional diversity training, and people will say, there'll be a discussion about being followed around in stores, and people will turn to me and say, did that happen to you? I mean,
not comfortable.
Yeah.
Well, yes,
Yeah.
I'm still in a place of privilege. So it did trigger something. Yes, that it's a tough thing to ask somebody to be vulnerable, and I think for women, asking a woman to be vulnerable. So if I were to share something and it got emotional and I started to cry, I would not necessarily be crying out of sadness. It could be frustration, it could be anger. It's just an expression of an emotion that can also make people really, really uncomfortable.
Curious, did you guys see the CEO that was crying the other day and got totally blasted on
Yes.
social media over it?
I saw the feedback. I didn't watch it because I just didn't want to see that train.
You just kind of, and I'm sure it's different for men and women. But in general, what do you think about that type of vulnerability?
I think it's a lot depends on the kind of organization you're in. I remember when I first joined Uber, I'd come from Japan where everything about work culture is completely different, pretty much, is probably the easy way to sum it up. And within a few months, some of my team members said, "Oh, Michael, you're so vulnerable." And I didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing. And in the end, I think in the Uber context, it wasn't a good thing because we had to be pretty tough all the time. It was a pretty aggressive environment that you might have read about in the New York Times. So I don't know if it was a good thing there. And ultimately, I wasn't a culture fit because of that. So I think it really does depend on the organization. And it's hard. And sort of to your point, the more senior you are, the more established you are, I think the easier it is to open up and be yourself. But there is a definite pressure, societal pressure or work culture pressure to conform to keep rising up, right? So there's a weird balance, or I don't know the right answer.
And then that armor you put around yourself as you're growing through the middle ranks,
right?
You forget to shed it. And that's where we get ourselves into trouble.
Kind of forget about the power of empathy for the people that work underneath you. Mm-hmm. So, and how you could connect with them before, and when they ran into a challenge, you had that emotional IQ to get them through. All of a sudden, you put up like this barrier, and they can't get through it. So, and I think I didn't see this episode of the CEO crying, but I think, Michael, to what you said, it depends on how close you are. You know, if it's a big company and I don't know the CEO from anyone else and they start crying, like I might have a total different perception. But if I broke down in front of the three of you, you know me well enough that you'd say, okay, I think I know where that comes from, and we can talk about it, and this could be an experience that we learn something from, or make positive, or at least bring down any negative energy that comes out of it. So, but you have to have that connection, and as you were saying, as you go up the ranks, it almost feels like you have to be bulletproof to keep going, and any vulnerability could end up being your weakness, and that could keep you from going the next step. But the sacrifice is the people underneath you that work for you, that all of a sudden are not connecting with you. Mm-hmm. I guess it's kind of a give and take, right? You know, like where do you want to go? Do you want to continually retain great people to work for you that actually help lift you up as well, because you are the fulcrum of their success, I guess is maybe a good term for it? Or are you going to just kind of see how far you can get and just accept that you're not connecting with your employees anymore?
I guess you said something about you feel like you got to be bulletproof, and I don't think that. I know what you mean by that. Like you have to be strong. If you're a leader, you have to be strong, and you have to be able to deal with problems, and things are thrown on us that are emotionally and mentally tasking, and you have to have that resilience, that strength. But I do think we talked about this in the past, like being empathetic, showing that you care. How do you balance that, where you're strong, but you also are soft when you need to be, and caring, and actually genuinely care about people? Because that's, like you talk about, like this armor that we build up. I don't think as a leader you should completely get rid of that armor, because we are the ones that get it. I mean, I know about not every problem, but people will tell me things, and other people are like, did you hear about that? Yeah, I heard about that a week ago. Like every major issue in a company usually makes it to the leader. Yeah. And we got to deal with that, and that's hard. How do you deal with that and stay strong, but also stay genuine and caring? How do you find that balance?
Well, I mean, for me, I think showing vulnerability, kind of to somewhat of what we talk about is a risk. How are people going to take it? You know, from the crying CEO, does a person know me well enough to understand what I'm talking about? I think you have to be measured in how you display that. You have to understand what outcome you're looking for from it, so you don't go kind of wayward or out of bounds, so that they take it the wrong way. You know, sometimes I open up and I'm more vulnerable about something to promote thoughtfulness. That like, hey, I got this wrong, and this is why I got it wrong, or at least this is what I learned. And it's okay for us to do that and to learn from it, and to start thinking about what haven't we thought about here. And so quickly you're like, oh, hey, you know, anyone can fail, but what do we learn from that? And let's start thinking, you know, the proverbial outside of the box, and see where that goes. Very quickly, they're identifying. They can identify. We all identify with each other is probably the best way to say it. And now we're working on the solution. So, or if it gets to the point where there's some frustrations or fears or something like that, identifying that. I'd say most likely that would be in a one-on-one in my scenarios where we have an opportunity to really talk about it and how you're feeling and really getting a sense of where they're at. So, and then judging, is this the right time to be empathetic or is it the right time to just listen and let them vent and let them get to where they're at? So that obviously is, as a man, a really hard thing to do because we're automatic fixers. So just, no, I don't need to fix this. I just need to listen.
You know, you asked this question about how do you balance the armor as a leader and the need to be empathetic and connect with folks. And I think being conscious about what we're holding in the center is the place to start. So with someone who's upset and crying about something that's happened in their organization, at the leader that you mentioned, is that person putting themselves at the center of that situation? And are they upset and crying about themselves? Or are they crying about the people who have left and had to go? What are we holding dear in that moment? So I worked with an executive who ran a big chunk of the operations side of a company, and his team loved him. They loved him, but he had to tell when a challenge came up, when the team shared a challenge, he would sort of do something with his hand that would trigger, like everybody knew this person's upset, this person's stressed out, and they would scramble to do whatever they could to make the problem go away as fast as possible. But it wasn't always the best solution. And so we actually practiced sitting on hands. Wow. It's such a basic thing, but sitting on hands to not allow that tell to show, and instead to say, where do we start? So actually just practice that and just go, where do we start? Where do we start? And so, and he ended up telling his team, I think that we're solving the problem to make me feel better, but this isn't about me feeling better. It's, they're all brilliant people on his team. He just had to figure out how to put the problem at the center. And he was unconsciously putting himself at the center, and his team, in their effort and desire to please and make him happy, was coming up with solutions that they worked, but they weren't really the best solutions.
Interesting.
That tangentially reminds me of feedback that I got once where I was talking just too much about myself. I was trying to share stories and trying to relate and show how I went through something, and the feedback that came back to me was, that's great, we don't need all your stories. Like, it's about us. And it was obviously hurt for a little bit. And then I tried to action that feedback and get better. But I think that's a real danger when trying to thread that needle of relating to your teams, right? Of, is it about you? Is it about them? And it's got to be about them, and they'll pick up on it right away if it's not.
I think that's why it's so easy, right? It's such a simple question. Who are you holding in the center right now? In this very moment, before you speak, who are you holding at the center right now? And that it can really shift perspective. It gives you some distance as well to step back and say, how am I showing up right now?
So all this that is required of people leaders, all these things that they have to deal with, last couple of years, how do we've heard about this, especially in the people in like the HR world, like the burnout. We've seen a lot of our colleagues who just like, I'm tapping out, I'm taking a year off, I'm just going to go, tour the world or do whatever. I think that's a healthy thing. But how do these individuals that have, as several of you talked about, they're like high leverage individuals in the organization. They have to manage up, they have to manage down. They're extremely important for the success of this company. How do they avoid burnout? How do they avoid getting to that point where, I've taken a sabbatical. It's important, I think, to do that at some point. But in between those times, how do you avoid where your cup is overflowing and you have got too much going in, you don't have enough that's helping you? How do you get to that point?
Ask for help. I got another different company feedback from a COO that I'd never asked for help. And I just didn't know I was allowed to ask for help. Just thought I just had to do it all. And that was more about running this part of the business. But I think in general, that same company, I would have probably succeeded or lasted longer, maybe is the right word, if I had an exec coach, for example. So I was just thinking you would make a great exec coach for me if you have any bandwidth. But I think
we're too close, Mike. We are. Don't coach my friends.
But I think that's actually pretty valuable, right? And it could be an exec coach. There's other things as well, but I think really within the work context, a good coach might be able to help you separate and like understand how to prioritize better, or like what to drop, or because there's always more work, and there's always more problems to be solved, right? So that's a pretty hard one.
I think there are a couple of things that lead to burnout. One is not making time for yourself, and just the bucket's empty. I don't know how many of you read that book about how full is your bucket, where if there's a hole in your bucket, it's leaky. If you don't plug the hole, you're going to run out. You're going to tap out. So in our house, we'll say, I need my bucket filled, and someone will come and hug you. And like a big, juicy hug, like really good one, just to fill the bucket up. You can take everything that's in my bucket, I'll say to my kids when they're having a bad day, or my husband, and they'll do the same for me. We don't hug at work in most places, which is fine, although I am a hugger. But I think that
I'd say the other piece of burnout, anecdotally, I'm gonna use a story from my past. You've had so many good ones. This was when I was at Pandora, and I happened to hire this fantastic gentleman to look over part of our recruiting that actually had far more experience being the head of talent than I did. But he just had kids, and he's like, I want to take a step back. And I found myself working to burnout levels, which was a pretty frequent thing in early career. And him and I sat down, and I was like, oh, I gotta get this done, this done. And he's like, well, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, if I don't do this, I'm like only as good as what I did, today, really. And he said, no, like the work's gonna be there tomorrow. Regardless of what you do, no matter how hard you work, the work's gonna be there tomorrow. Pace yourself, slow down, and understand what result you need and when you need to get it, and then break it down like that. Don't pull it forward because you're trying to impress somebody or because you feel you need to, because in the end you're gonna burn out and then you're just not gonna do good work. So really it was actually a big turning point in my career because I started doing things differently. Mostly because of what I started with, of like feeling I need to. And then working in those areas of things that I didn't really enjoy. Maybe instead I have somebody else do it that does enjoy that. I don't know, love to hear the thoughts on, do we feel comfortable enough to say that these days, that I'm just not excited about that work, I'd really like to focus in this area? Or is that a faux pas still? Like, you can't say it.
I'm curious, because I think we've all gotten to our point in our careers where we enjoy what we do, and I definitely know what I'm not good at. And I try to stay in the areas, we always have to do things we don't enjoy. It's just the reality of life in general, whether it's at home or it's at work or whatever. It's always something you have to do. But if you can spend more time in those areas that you're good at, that's when you're happy. Like, what do you think it was the moments that were the seminal moments for us when we realized, this is where I need to spend my time? You've talked a little bit about the areas you need to spend your time, but what was that aha moment where it's like, I gotta stop doing this, I gotta focus on this? Because for these managers, sometimes they maybe are in that spot because they're just thinking, I gotta climb the career ladder because that's what I gotta do, and they get into this role where they're no longer happy. How do they figure out, like, I gotta shift, I gotta do something different to get in that spot where they're spending their time doing the stuff where they're truly happy, and then probably way more effective at what they do?
I think, what do you love? Really, that's what it comes down to.
Skateboarding, so.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's still time to be a professional skateboarder. Tony Hawk's still going. But no, I actually bring this question up all the time with people that are looking for a job. Obviously, we've been in recruiting for a long time, and so you still get the questions, and I ask them, what do you love to do? You're going to focus most of your energy and be most productive in what you love to do. And if you're looking for a job, there's no better time than the present, especially if you don't love what you're doing right now. Start to look at the recent past. How often are you thinking, I want a new job, I want to do some, I'm unhappy with this or that or whatever? Are you really, this is what you say you love and this is what you're doing? So at some point you need to start working on what you love. And that's going to be your way forward. The longer you sit in, I don't love doing this land, the longer you just have this constant turnover, this constant unhappiness, this constant burnout. It's never going to change. It's like delaying starting your life in a way. So,
Or you better find that energy and joy in something that you're doing outside of work, and it needs to consume your time outside of work.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
I
that's
think
a really good point.
to the extent that we're blessed and fortunate enough to have a manager or someone in our work world who calls us out on things that we can do better, it's an opportunity to pay attention, right? It's never easy to take feedback and to receive feedback. It's uncomfortable. I know we in HR try to say feedback is a gift. Feedback is sometimes a very uncomfortable and an unpleasant gift. Let's be upfront about that. But if we have some time, so sometimes it's give a little distance, but take the time to sort of reflect on what's the themes, what are the common messages that are coming across. Maybe we can start to see a pattern.
I think that's a good point. You might not, in all phases of your life, you might not be at a phase where you get to love your work, and that might be okay too. My grandpa always used to say he was a chemist, and he was always to say he felt quite fortunate that he got to do work he loved, but it wasn't his first thing in life. There was a lot more of life than work. But to your point of how to figure that out, I think there's the Japanese concept called ikigai, which is where what do you love? What does the world need? What can you get paid to do? And where these things overlap, that middle spot, like if you can get there, that's great. I think you can put a lot of pressure on yourself to try to get there as well, right? Like maybe what I love doing doesn't really actually pay, and I got kids to put through college, so I'm gonna have to do other stuff too. But it is great if you can sort of self-actualize at work too, like you said.
I think what you said is kind of what you both said is important. Is like work isn't the only thing in the world, and sometimes it shouldn't be the most important thing in the world. And yes, we spend a lot of our time on it, and some of us get fortunate enough to do things that we love. But I know plenty of people who work part-time or work on a job they don't like because the stuff they do, it allows them to do the stuff outside of work that they truly love, and it puts in kind of what you talked about, like. You got responsibilities. You got to feed yourself. You got to put a roof over your head. You got these things you have to do. But if there's something you love to do that doesn't pay, this job can allow you to do that. So you could be one of these people where you love what you're doing and you get paid for it. You could be somebody who you love something else you don't get paid for, so you take a job that allows you to be able to do that. I think that's an important thing, is figuring out what you love and setting yourself up in whatever way that is to be able to do that and get fulfillment from that. And it could be work. It could be the work empowers you to get fulfillment in a different way.
Yeah, because I think we have to acknowledge, at least in the U.S., there's a very large portion of the country that has to work and may not have choice in the same kinds of choices that we may have. And taking that into consideration, then being very aware of what part of the job is, or jobs, plural, are the ones that make them feel really energized and successful and proud, and where else might they get that sort of thing. So for some people, they may discover that they're really good at helping other people learn a technique or learn something that's required on the job. And that may tap into something in them that has been sort of hiding. And all of a sudden, they sort of come into their own and they realize, hey, I'm actually really good as a teacher of some sort. I could be a field trainer, or I could be a, whatever, but it's sort of tapping into that thing that's been hiding. And I think when we find people who don't get that energy from work or from something else, they haven't identified what it is that really makes them feel alive. So for some of us, it's a constant journey too. We may surprise ourselves. I had somebody that I had talked to, absolutely didn't want to be a people manager, refused, didn't want to do it. Her company kept asking her to take it on. She kept refusing. She finally got it, loved it, and was excellent at it. So sometimes somebody had to tell her, actually, no, we want you to try this, and we're willing to take a risk. If you decide you don't want to do it, you can go back to being an IC. But what an eye-opening experience. She had to just take it.
Very, very insightful comments from you all. I think this is a great discussion about stuff we've all had to deal with and stuff people are, and we're still dealing with. I think probably plenty of people out there are going to have to deal with at some point. So hopefully they can take something away from this that is valuable for them. Thank you.
Awesome.
Appreciate it.
Great.